She just wanted to withdraw her own money until the bank manager humiliated her. But then her son walked in. Marjorie Whittaker had always believed in routine. It gave life a sense of order, a rhythm she could trust. Every first Monday of the month, she walked into Riverstone First Bank in Sacramento, California, the same branch she had used for over 2 decades. The tellers knew her by name, she knew theirs, and there was comfort in that familiarity. But today, something felt different. The usual friendly chatter was missing. The warm greetings replaced by quick, almost nervous glances. The young woman at the reception desk, who usually smiled, kept her gaze fixed on her computer. Marjorie adjusted the strap of her purse and pressed forward, ignoring the strange energy in the air. At the counter, she pulled out her checkbook and slid a withdrawal slip across the polished surface. $3,000. Enough to patch up her leaking roof before the rainy season returned. She fished out her ID and placed it beside the slip. Simple. Routine. Then came the voice. Sharp, clipped, with just the right amount of condescension to make Marjorie's stomach tighten. "Can I help you?" She turned to see a woman she hadn't met before, Victoria Langford, the new branch manager. Mid-40s, impeccably dressed, with dark blonde hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful. A clipboard tucked against her side, a faint smirk on her lips. Marjorie met her gaze, offering a polite smile. "Yes, I'd like to make a withdrawal." Victoria barely glanced at the slip before speaking again. "And you are?" The question hit Marjorie like a slap. "Excuse me? I don't recognize you," Victoria said, her tone flat. "Large withdrawals require extra verification." Marjorie straightened, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "I've banked here for 20 years. Victoria's smirk didn't waver. "That may be, but policy is policy." A familiar heat crept into Marjorie's chest. She had heard that tone before. It wasn't about policy. It was about power. "You can check my account history," Marjorie said, keeping her voice calm. Victoria sighed, tapping her manicured nails against the counter. "I still need to verify the funds. You understand? We've had incidents." The words hung in the air. Incidents. Misunderstandings. The kind that only seemed to happen to people like her. A few customers had started watching. A man shifting uncomfortably by the deposit slips. A young woman pretending not to listen. Marjorie's hands trembled as she reached into her purse for her phone. There was only one person she trusted to handle this, and Victoria had no idea who was about to walk through that door. Marjorie's fingers hovered over her phone screen, hesitating for just a second. She hated this feeling. The lump in her throat, the sting of being reduced to someone suspicious in a place that should have felt safe. She had never caused trouble, never bounced a check, never been late on a bill. Yet here she was, a retired teacher, a grandmother, a loyal customer, being treated like an intruder in her own bank. Victoria, still standing firm with that smirk, leaned over the counter slightly. "If you can't provide additional identification, I'm afraid I can't authorize this withdrawal." Marjorie took a steady breath. "My ID is right there." Victoria barely glanced at it. "And I need further proof. You understand, it's just protocol." Protocol. A word that had a way of twisting itself into something ugly when it was used to justify a wrong. Marjorie didn't want to cause a scene, but she felt trapped. If she walked away now, what would stop this woman from doing the same thing next time? If she let this slide, what message would that send? The tension in the room thickened. The young teller at the next window stole nervous glances at Victoria, as if unsure whether to step in. The security guard near the entrance shifted on his feet, watching. A deep breath. Calm, measured, firm. "You've never needed anything more than my ID before." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't the manager before." The words hit harder than they should have. The way she said it, like it meant things were going to be different now. Like Marjorie's long history with the bank didn't matter. Like she didn't matter. And then Victoria did something that made Marjorie's stomach twist. She turned away, as if the conversation was over. As if Marjorie was a waste of her time. That was it. Marjorie's hand steadied as she pressed her son's number. A dial tone, 1 ring, then 2, and then, "Hey Ma, you okay?" Relief flooded through her, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm at the bank. Can you come down here?" A pause. Christopher knew her well enough to catch the tension in her voice. "I'm on my way." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her purse. Victoria let out a short, amused breath. Calling for backup. Marjorie met her eyes, no longer trying to hide the steel in her voice. Something like that. For the first time, Victoria looked uncertain. She had no idea that backup was about to walk through that door in a tailored suit, and a name that carried more weight in this bank than hers ever would. But the real question was, how would she act when she realized the truth? Victoria checked her watch and sighed. "You can wait over there if you like." She gestured to a row of stiff-backed chairs near the entrance, the kind no one ever wanted to sit in. "But I doubt whoever you called can change bank policy." Marjorie didn't move. She wasn't about to be shuffled off like a problem to be dealt with later. The doors to the bank swung open, and in stepped Christopher Whitaker, tall, sharp-dressed, and carrying the quiet authority of a man who knew exactly who he was. His grey suit was crisp, his shoes polished, and his presence turned heads immediately. Some of the tellers straightened in their chairs. A security guard, who had been idly watching from the side, suddenly looked more alert. Even the customers in line took notice. Christopher didn't need to announce himself. The room had already shifted. He spotted his mother standing at the counter and the way Victoria was looking at her. Dismissive, irritated, as if she were an inconvenience. His jaw tensed, but his voice was smooth when he spoke. "Mom." He stepped up beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "What's going on?" Victoria's eyes flicked between them. She straightened, pushing that smug expression back into place. "And you are?" Christopher didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at his mother, scanning her expression. The way she was holding her purse just a little too tightly, the way her mouth was pressed into a thin line, that told him everything he needed to know. He turned back to Victoria, his gaze steady. Christopher Whitaker. Silence. Something flickered in Victoria's eyes, a brief flash of recognition, but she didn't react fast enough. One of the tellers behind her, a young man who had been watching with a nervous expression, broke the tension. "That's Mr. Whitaker, ma'am," the teller murmured. "The new owner." Victoria blinked. "Owner?" Christopher smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Majority owner, to be exact. And from what I can tell, my mother was trying to make a simple withdrawal." "So why exactly is there a problem?" Victoria's confidence visibly cracked. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Marjorie finally spoke, her voice as steady as it had been when she commanded a classroom full of restless students. She said she needed to verify the funds. Christopher let the words hang in the air for a moment before looking back at Victoria. "Is that so?" Victoria swallowed hard. "We have policies. Policies that somehow only applied to my mother today." His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it now. Victoria tried to recover. "It was just a misunderstanding." Christopher nodded slowly, as if considering that. "I see. And tell me, Victoria, how often do these misunderstandings happen?" Her face paled, because they both knew the answer to that, but Christopher wasn't done yet. The room was so silent you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. All eyes were on Christopher and Victoria, the energy shifting from a routine bank visit to something far more serious. Victoria straightened, desperately trying to regain control. "Mr. Whitaker, I assure you, this was nothing more than a simple policy matter." Christopher tilted his head slightly. "A simple policy matter?" His voice was calm, almost amused, but his gaze was sharp. "Let's be clear on something. My mother, an account holder of over 20 years, was publicly humiliated while trying to withdraw her own money. And you're telling me that's just policy?" Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. She knew she was walking on thin ice. Marjorie, who had been quiet up until now, let out a slow breath. "I've never had a problem before." "Not until today." Christopher nodded. "Exactly." Then he turned back to Victoria. "So tell me, why was today different?" The weight of the question landed like a hammer. Victoria's face twitched. She was still clinging to the idea that she could spin this into a misunderstanding. "We just have to be cautious about large cash withdrawals. It's about security, you understand." Christopher chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Security. Right." He glanced around the bank, motioning toward a man at the far end who had just walked away from the counter. "That gentleman over there withdrew cash just now. I didn't see you questioning him. Victoria stiffened but said nothing. Christopher leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice but making sure everyone around them still heard. This wasn't about security. This was about power. You thought you could get away with it, that no one would step in. Victoria swallowed. She knew there was no walking this back. The tellers stood frozen behind the counter, watching their boss squirm in front of the man who now had the final say over her career. Christopher exhaled, straightening. I'm going to make something very clear. This is my bank now, and there's no place here for someone who treats customers, especially long-time, loyal customers, like criminals. Victoria's face drained of color. She stammered. I was just following. Christopher raised a hand. You can stop now. You've said enough. Then, without another word, he turned to his mother. Do you still want to withdraw the money, Ma? Marjorie smiled, the first real smile since she had walked in. Yes, I do. A young teller, one who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes, rushed forward to assist her. Victoria stood frozen, realizing too late that she had just cost herself everything. But the real consequences were still coming. Victoria stood there, rigid, her carefully maintained poise crumbling with each second that passed. The weight of the room's silence pressed down on her. The other bank employees weren't stepping in to defend her, nor were they making eye contact. They knew. Everyone knew. Christopher turned to the teller assisting his mother, a young woman with nervous hands but quick movements. Take care of her, and make sure she gets what she came for. The young woman nodded swiftly, her eyes darting between Christopher and Victoria before focusing on processing the withdrawal. There was no hesitation this time. Victoria, however, still clung to some last shred of hope. She straightened her blazer and tried for a controlled tone, though the strain was evident. Mr. Whitaker, I understand that you're upset. Christopher didn't let her finish. No. What you don't understand is that this isn't just about my mother. His voice was even, but the sharp edge returned. How many other customers have you treated this way? How many people have walked in here only to be met with your so-called policies? Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came. Christopher exhaled, shaking his head slightly. This isn't a conversation anymore. He turned toward a tall man standing near the offices. The regional director, Andrew Hastings. He had arrived at some point during the exchange, standing back, observing. A seasoned executive, his expression remained unreadable. But Christopher knew exactly what his presence meant. Andrew stepped forward now, clearing his throat. Mr. Whitaker, if you'd like to discuss staffing decisions privately. Christopher waved a hand. There's no need. Victoria, you're done here. Victoria flinched as if she'd been struck. Wait, effective immediately, Christopher continued. Your position as branch manager is terminated. I'll make sure your severance paperwork is handled accordingly. The words landed hard. A few gasps rippled through the employees, but no one looked surprised. Victoria's face was stark white now. She wasn't just losing a job, she was losing power. And she knew it. She had gotten comfortable, thought she was untouchable. Now, the very person she had tried to humiliate had brought her down. For a moment she stood there blinking rapidly, trying to compose herself, trying to salvage what little was left. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit. She didn't bother looking back. The heavy glass doors closed behind her, and just like that, Riverston First Bank had one less problem. But Christopher wasn't finished just yet. As the doors shut behind Victoria, the tension in the bank seemed to shift. Employees who had been frozen in place exhaled. Customers who had been pretending not to listen resumed their business, and the tellers exchanged quick glances, processing what had just happened. But Christopher wasn't done. He turned back to the counter where his mother stood. The teller assisting her, Rebecca Wilkes according to her name tag, worked quickly, counting out the money with careful precision. Unlike before, her hands were steady. The fear that had been there moments ago had vanished. As Marjorie collected the cash and tucked it neatly into her purse, Christopher spoke again, this time addressing everyone. I want something to be clear. His voice carried through the bank, firm but not harsh. This isn't just about my mother. What happened today is exactly what won't happen again in this bank. Andrew Hastings, still standing nearby, gave a slight nod. He knew this was coming. Christopher continued pacing slowly. I want every single employee in this branch to understand that our customers, the people who trust us with their money, their savings, their future, are not to be treated as inconveniences." He looked around. "They are the reason this institution exists." A few tellers shifted uncomfortably, but most looked attentive. "We will be reviewing every single case of so-called policy enforcement from the past 6 months. His tone sharpened slightly. "If I find even one more example of bias, unnecessary scrutiny, or selective enforcement of rules, there will be consequences." Rebecca lowered her eyes, her face tight with quiet understanding. She had likely seen similar incidents before, but hadn't spoken up. Christopher looked at her directly. "If anyone ever feels pressured to uphold a policy that doesn't align with fairness and respect, my door is open." She nodded. But this wasn't a gesture of fear. It was relief. Marjorie, silent throughout the speech, finally turned to her son. "Let's go." Her voice was steady, and there was something in her expression that felt lighter. Christopher gave a small nod, placing a hand on her back as they walked toward the doors. As they stepped outside into the afternoon light, Marjorie took a slow breath. "You didn't have to do all that, you know." Christopher smirked slightly. "Yeah, I did." She studied him, a slow smile forming. "Well, you always did have a way of handling things." Christopher chuckled. "That's what I'm here for." Behind them, Riverstone First Bank was already starting to change. But the real impact wouldn't be in what happened inside the bank today. It would be in the way people were treated there from now on. As Christopher and Marjorie walked toward the parking lot, the weight of what had happened still lingered between them. For Marjorie, it wasn't just about today. It was about every single time someone like Victoria had made someone like her feel small. It was about the times she had chosen to walk away instead of fight. Today, thanks to her son, she hadn't needed to. She unlocked the car, but before getting in, she turned to him. "You didn't just fire that woman. You made a statement." Christopher leaned against the passenger door, arms crossed. "That was the point." She studied him, the sharp angles of his face that still carried traces of the little boy she had raised. "You always did know how to handle yourself." He smirked. "Learned from the best." Marjorie shook her head, but she was smiling now. "This isn't the first time I've been treated like that, you know." Christopher's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers drumming against the car door. "I figured as much." She hesitated. "But it's the first time I've ever seen someone actually held accountable." Christopher met her eyes, the hint of frustration still there. "That's the problem, Ma. It shouldn't have to take someone like me walking in to fix it." She exhaled, nodding slowly. "You're right, but that's why today mattered." For a moment they stood there, the California sun warming their skin, the hum of passing cars filling the silence. Christopher finally spoke. "I'm making sure every branch under my ownership knows what happened here. They're going to remember what respect looks like, and what happens when you refuse to give it." Marjorie placed a hand on his arm, squeezing gently. "You did good today." He gave her a small smile, then reached for the door handle. "Come on, I'm taking you to lunch. My treat." She chuckled as she slid into the driver's seat. "Now that's an offer I won't argue with." As they pulled away, the bank shrank in the rearview mirror, but the impact of what had happened inside would remain. Not just for Victoria, not just for the employees, but for every single person who walked through those doors from this day forward. As Christopher and Marjorie drove through the streets of Sacramento, the weight of the day slowly began to fade. But its lesson? That would last. Marjorie glanced at her son, her heart full, not just with pride, but with something deeper. Vindication. Justice. For once, someone had stood up when it mattered, and not just anyone. Her son. She thought about all the times in her life when she had been treated differently for no reason other than someone thinking they could get away with it. People like Victoria thrived in systems that let them operate unchecked. But today, that cycle had been broken. Christopher, keeping one hand on the wheel, turned to her. "You okay?" She exhaled, nodding. "I am now." They didn't need to say much more. Some things didn't need words. They just needed action. Back at Riverstone First Bank, employees still whispered about what had happened. Tellers exchanged knowing glances. Policies were already being reviewed, and the customers who had witnessed it, they'd tell the story. A story about a woman who walked into her own bank, was humiliated, and for once in her life, saw justice in real time. Victoria Langford would find another job eventually, but she would never forget this day, because the next time she thought about treating someone differently, she'd remember how quickly power could shift. And maybe, just maybe, she'd think twice. Respect is free. But too often, people like Victoria don't pay it forward until they're forced to. If you've ever seen something like this happen, or worse, if you've been in Marjorie's shoes, know this: you deserve better. Stand up when you can. Speak out when you must. And if you ever find yourself with the power to make a change, use it, because moments like this, they matter.